Peace and blessings. This is Raisa Kiwala, the divorced Muslim coach. I'm really excited today to host this week's weekly wisdom on the topic, on this ongoing series that we have around Muslim men and their healing. And there you are. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I was just getting ready to, let's see, add you. Here we go. Assalamu alaikum, Jordan. Assalamu alaikum, Arabian. Good to see you. See if you can accept my invitation and we can start talking.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa barakatuhu. Good to see you. Thank you for being here today.
Absolutely. Good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. And, welcome to everyone who's joining us. We're going to get started right away. Let us know where you're coming in from and what you'd like to learn about this ongoing series of understanding Muslim men and their journey of healing and how we can be allies on the same team here. Right. So, I was inspired to see another Muslim man who is doing the conscious work of returning back to our fitra and then inspiring other men to do that as well and striving to embody the prophetic example. I feel like in my own work, I do a similar work with women. It's very inspiring and refreshing and hopeful to see men doing that for themselves and their brothers. And then my goal really here in these series and for today is to really see how through understanding, through listening, through hearing, through understanding, how we can be those allies and those counterparts to each other as men and women in our ummah. So welcome, Jordan. And let me allow you to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and what you do and what got you into it.
MashaAllah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi salam. So I'm Jordan. I am actually calling in from Washington, D.C. I live close to, not in Washington, D.C., but quite close to it. And I'm a Muslim convert. I became Muslim over 10 years ago now, and that's a whole story in and of itself, so we won't really get into that. But I got into this work of really wanting to help men sort of get back into their fitrah, to rediscover their fitrah, and to live as real men following the prophetic example. I got into this because of my own issues that I discovered years ago. I had been divorced previously as well, and ended up getting remarried. And unfortunately, like some of the questions that you received indicated, I did not yet really deal with my issues prior to getting remarried. But having a child and being married to a wonderful woman that I'm married to really forced me to take a hard look at myself. And I would say the pivotal moment to all of that really set the light bulb off was reading a book called Boys Adrift by Dr. Leonard Sachs. And it was like I was reading about myself, because he was laying out all the issues that boys and men are dealing with and how their behaviors are continuing to sort of change from what traditional men have been like, and some of the challenges that we face, that I was like, this is what I have to do something like this, because this is something that and also the stories I see from not just you and the things that women go through, but the things that men are struggling with too. I see how much men and women today are struggling with each other. And I was really happy that you reached out to me about this topic of working together, because men and women, we do need each other. I think maybe it feels good sometimes to say, well, I don't need men in my life, or I don't need a woman in my life, but the reality is that we know we do need each other. And there's a reason why Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, marriage is half your deen. In some narrations, he says marriage is 2/3 of your deen. So we know that marriage is very important, and that having functional, successful, healthy relationships between men and women are extremely important. So, inshallah, that's a quick little thing there.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Um, it's I think it's important when we share and we connect with each other on a human to human level, that talking about our lived experiences really allows us to get a deeper understanding and connection with each other in order to keep moving forward.
Yes.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. And for just being here, being willing to hear and be part of the conversation. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So please do share your comments and your questions as we go along. And with that, I'm going to start off with, I work with women, usually mostly exclusively. I've worked with a couple of brothers here and there, but mostly women. And I'm a woman myself with my own lived experience of my own divorce being the impetus to my spiritual and emotional rebirth, and my own personal journey. And some of the things that I hear a lot from women is there's a lot of resentment and anger and almost like a blame, blaming men for a lot of their problems. And I'd like to unpack, and this is not, I just want to preface by saying that this is not about a blame game. This is not about blaming someone, because that is not the solution. And that just keeps you stuck in victim mode, because then you have no power to change or to do anything and to make changes within your life, because only you can do that. So this is more about, hearing each other's sides and narratives, and being able to come from a deeper place of understanding. So through that, we can compassionately deal with each other, with our issues and our problems, and find solutions.
Yeah. Sure.
So as you mentioned, we are counterparts to each other, right? We are on the same team. We're all in the same ummah. And, in a lot of what we're seeing today, that the family system has broken down. And it's not just, in the cultures and the society that we live in, but it's in our own Muslim ummah as well. That we're seeing that with all of the breakups and breakdowns in marriages and the disruption in the family structure. And then you have the disruption in society as well. So, I want to talk about pain, because it's as you said, we're struggling. Men and women are struggling, and with that comes pain. And working with women, some of the things that I shared, in my story and with you as well, around one of the complaints was like, well, why don't men get help? Why don't men deal with their issues, instead of, one sister said, rinse and repeat, right, within another relationship? And you touched on that a little bit. But I want to talk about and ask you, from your perspective, of the man's perspective, what is that like for men in terms of feeling pain? Because there's also like this understanding from the woman's perspective, is that I'm feeling all the pain. I'm feeling all this pain and hurt, and he's just off, moving on, so to speak. So let's talk a little bit about what is pain experienced and felt like for men, and how do they cope with it, and to recognize that we all feel pain as human beings, and there's a difference in how we cope with it. So share with me a little bit from your research, your learnings, your teachings, your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Bismillah. So I guess there's a few ways we could look at this, and I would like to kind of start with maybe a general narrative about men and masculinity in general, and maybe why men typically handle pain or deal with pain in a different way than women do. There's a really great brother I have a lot of respect for. His name is Kareem Sirajuddin. He has a business, Newer Human Consulting, also has a great podcast, Coffee with Kareem, so check it out. I was fortunate enough to be a guest of his on there a while ago, and he painted a really great narrative about men, right, and how men are sort of hardwired, and then also along with hardwiring comes a socialization that often matches that hardwiring, at least in some ways. So if you think about the history of humankind, the time in which we live currently is quite different. We live by the rule of law. Most of us don't have to worry about raiders coming and taking from the tribe or burning our homes down or things like this, alhamdulillah. But in the past, that was very much something to worry about, especially if we lived in tribal kinship groups. And in these, like, more primitive tribal kinship groups and other places in society too, not just on the primitive level, men were de facto the warriors, the hunters, the providers, and they often saw and had to do things that were quite traumatic and quite hard. And they did it for survival. And we even see this in decades ago where men, especially in the Industrial Revolution, were working 12, 14 hours a day just to put a roof over the head of their children. They don't have time to think about, I have somebody, so-and-so said something mean to me today. Like, they don't have time to think about, they're just trying to survive, right? So there's this conditioning that we as men have to be tough. And we have to, in order to be a man, you have to tough it out. You have to be strong. And that sort of disconnects us from ourselves. And perhaps at one time that made sense, and in certain situations that's where men are going to be. And even women go through this too, when we become so traumatized or so beaten down with the hardships of life that we become detached from ourselves. And often we as men, especially still in our ummah, there's a lot of pressure to be a provider, to be a person who's strong, to make a good amount of money. And sometimes if you focus only on going out into the world and doing these things, and you sort of just soldier on without really thinking about your needs or these other things, you can kind of lose touch with yourself, right? And this is, of course, one component to all of this. This is not the only thing. This is a very big picture. But I do think that plays a really large role in why men in general are not as connected to themselves. But also biologically, it's shown that men simply handle stress better and handle pain better than women anyway. They handle physical pain better. They handle stress. Their cortisol levels are usually lower if they're in stressful situations at work. They're not as affected by those things on a biological level as well. So sometimes a thing that maybe a woman or somebody who's a bit more sensitive, a man who might be more sensitive, they might think, this is something really painful to me. But you might have a man who's like, what are you talking about? I'm doing my job. What do you want me to do, right? So there's some general differences between us as men and women in terms of feeling pain, but men certainly do feel pain, especially in our time. As we fast forward now, there has been that the changes in society have been so fast and so radical now that men are really in a crisis. And I would break it down as this, and maybe we can build on this a bit more. I tried thinking, how can I summarize what men are dealing with right now?
I think that's a great point. I think that's a great point. I just want to pause and reflect on that.
Yeah, of course, please. Yeah.
You're right about drastic changes happening in our times, even in the last 100 years of how we used to live compared to how we live now, and how we are built, right?
Yes.
In our fitra, in our hard wiring. And then with this, the last thing that you were saying about men are in a crisis. And that should be very concerning to the women as well, because without men, we don't, how do we keep going? We need men and women to keep surviving, right? And so, and if there are brothers and there are fathers and there are uncles and there are sons, those are included in the men, and we have a stake in that. So I think it's very important to understand there's a lot of crises that are happening, but I think to really understand at the basic level that men are in crises, or I've heard people say under attack. I mean, there's a lot of things that are under attack, like the whole family unit, you know,
Yeah, of
the
course.
family unit, gender is an attack, but that's a separate issue. But I just want to pause and to reflect on men are in a crisis and their whole persona has shifted. So I
Yeah.
didn't mean to interrupt you. I just thought that was really
No,
impactful.
no, I think it's a great time. And I was actually thinking it was time to pause a little bit, actually. So you read my mind. Um,
You know what? I'm going to
yeah,
ask all these amazing 13 souls that we have on what are their thoughts so far to share in the comments, and what do they see in terms of the family unit, in terms of male and female, as you continue on, and we can address that as we go.
sounds great. MashaAllah. So what I was thinking about all of this, right? But before our conversation today, I took some time to really reflect on the questions that you actually shared with me too. I took some time to really think about the questions that some of your audience asked. But I was thinking, if I could really distill what are the issues that men are facing right now, and I was trying to think. I came up with 2 points. Number one was that we don't know how to be men. That's number one. But number two, which is like, if you don't address number two, you can't even get to number one, is we don't even know what it means to be men. So we don't know what it means. What does it mean to be a man? And then we don't know how. Even if we do know what it means, how do we get there? And, kind of going back a little bit to the way that societies used to be, we used to have rites of passage. These incredible events where you took a child and transitioned them into adulthood. And both men and women had these. But for women, they typically don't need as drastic a rite of passage, because their changes as they change from children to adult women, their biological changes are so drastic, and that those biological changes are so deeply rooted in how they inform a woman's role in classical society, that as soon as you were a woman, you could get pregnant, get married, and if you were pregnant and had a baby, your job was the baby. And so who else is going to, that just makes sense, right? But for men, it's very different, because masculinity, if it is not properly guided and directed, becomes very destructive.
Mm.
And this is, and femininity can be destructive too if it's not properly guided as well. But masculinity, if it is not channeled right, and the young man does not learn the importance of responsibility, the importance of self-sacrifice, the importance of taking care of one's family and the people that you're responsible for, that energy has nowhere else to go. And it's going to manifest in some way or another. And we're actually seeing that, another wonderful brother, Fahim Farouk, who is Focus 180 is his organization that he works with a lot of men. I think he said something along these lines a few times, that we think about the types of men that commit mass shootings and the types of men who are abusing women. These are not the cream of the crop masculine men. These are men who are deeply emasculated. Men who feel like they're carrying a lot of shame, they're carrying a lot of anger. They often have dealt with a lot of abuse. They've dealt with a lot of rejection from females. There's a lot of issues, and they sort of lash out, and we say, well, look at masculinity, look at how terrible it is. But it's like, well,
Yeah, someone
let's
is
take a
saying
step back.
that's where the term toxic masculinity, we hear that so often, right? It's thrown around all the time, like anything that a man does is toxic masculinity. Maybe we can expand a little bit on that, just to kind of unpack that a little bit. And before you get into that, I want to just give a shout out to Ahmed from Dustin Tribe. He joined in. He actually has programs where he has a program for father and sons as a rite of passage that they do out in nature. A lot of his programs, which I've also participated in, connect us to Allah's creation of the nature and each other, and that, that deep belonging that we feel with each other through Allah's creation of nature. So, alhamdulillah for that type of work.
That's
So I
amazing.
just wanted to give a shout out to Ahmed. And yeah, maybe you can expand on that term, toxic masculinity, and um, something that you said about if it's not channeled, this energy, the masculine energy is not properly channeled with undercurrents of shame and anger, it can become destructive. And
Yes.
then that's what we see in the toxic masculinity. So maybe you can unpack a
Hmm.
little bit of that.
Yeah, mashallah. Yeah, toxic masculinity is a very interesting term, and I have, there is a thing as toxic masculinity, and there's also toxic femininity. We also have to be aware that both energies, if improperly enacted, can be very damaging. Um, Toxic masculinity, I sometimes prefer to use a term like maybe misdirected or immature or boy masculinity. It's a masculinity that has yet to be, either it has not matured, or it's being misguided, or it has been sufficiently suppressed and shamed and abused, where now it's coming out in these mutated ways. I think one example we can think about is the impact of fatherlessness
Mm.
on young boys and
Yeah.
young men and what this does to them. And I think someone mentioned in the comments about the African American community in specific,
Yeah.
and this is a really important point I wanted to bring up in general about our ummah. Our ummah, many of us in our ummah are come from traumatized people. Think about what does colonization do to people?
Divide and
What
conquer.
does it what does it do when when a colonizer comes in and takes your family before you and rapes your wife and kills your children in front of you? What does that do to a man's psyche? What does it do to the African American community to be enslaved for 300 plus years and then deal with Jim Crow, then deal with the crime bill and deal with all the other things that come along with that? These are deeply significant traumas that have affected us, and they continue to affect us. And this is why it's so important that both men and women really get the help they need to deal with this stuff. Because if we don't, on the topic of fatherlessness, then you find boys and men who are trying to find belonging. They're trying to find a way to live in a way where they feel powerful. People don't want to be powerless. And especially, I think men have this sort of like inherent need to feel powerful and to feel strong and to feel respected and
Yes,
honored.
it's part of their fitra.
It's part of our fitra, and if that we're gonna try to find a way to get that. And some people, they turn to things like pornography and video games. A lot of our young men do. Some people turn to joining gangs on the more extreme end of that. And so
And
I think,
I want to
yeah.
just point out that along that line, some of the responses that came up from my audience were like, why are men so controlling, or why are they so insensitive, right? Like these behaviors that we're seeing in relationships is also can be a way to channel that energy in
Yeah.
a way that the only way they know how, or that has been modeled for them, or
Yeah.
that has been shown for them in survival patterns.
Yeah. That's a really great point, because that was one thing I actually wrote down about modeling. And then also the thing with controlling behavior as well is that you have certain temperament types that are very controlling too. Like I do a lot of work around temperament, and I really believe in that people generally fall into 4 different temperament types, and even modern psychology is supporting this. There's a should have written down his name for this, but there was a relatively modern psychologist who did his own research, and he ended up finding out there are 4 basic temperament types. This is outside of
I
temperament
think we
theory,
have
but
that in our deen too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot. That's a big part of our tradition as well. And some people even say that if you look at some ahadith, have it in between the lines a little bit. It's not directly, but it can be inferred. But in general, there are certain temperament types that can be controlling, and they sort of have this need to want things the way that they are. But I think, to your point, even women will tend to do this in some cases. And I brought up the
Yeah.
example when I was writing things down, is that in certain cultures of ours, mother-in-laws are just the worst. Like, they've been controlled and abused and chained to the kitchen their whole life and dominated their whole life, and finally now I have somebody I can just unleash on, and I can feel powerful. I can now feel powerful. People want to feel like that they matter.
Yeah,
They want to
because
feel worthy, you
a
know?
self authority and agency is part of our fitra too. Like we're
Absolutely.
designed to live that way. And somebody mentioned here, it's just what you mentioned about the whole mother-in-law thing is like they're just generational patterns, right? They're just
Yeah.
playing out until somebody stops and pauses and say, wait a minute, am I happy? Am I satisfied? Am I doing the right thing? Is this how life is meant to be, right? Until you
Hmm.
pause to reflect on yourself, nothing is going to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, thankfully, that if there's some benefit to all of the us being inundated with technology and with social media, is that we're having our eyes opened, and we're able to have these conversations and meet people and connect with people who like have had similar experiences to what we have, and we can talk and say, I feel this way, like I feel this way too. And maybe traditionally we didn't necessarily have that because behind a screen there's some anonymity that happens, and maybe we feel more open to saying certain things. And I think now people are starting to really, realize and address a lot of the things that maybe our grandparents and our parents didn't have the luxuries to address. And so it's imperative that all of us, men and women, take the time to to fix our emotional health and to get emotionally healthy, because we live in, Hakeem Archuleta, who's a relatively well-known scholar. He's educated in the Hakeem tradition of South Asia, and I think he said in one of his talks that we live in our time is inherently traumatizing. We live in a traumatic age, and so those are things that have to be addressed and mitigated by
Yeah.
both men and women, and we have to be accountable to those things.
I think one of the things you mentioned about, our parents or grandparents, perhaps, coming from, who have been immigrants. Like I know that, I don't know what area you're from, or, if you have history in this country, but, and a lot of the Muslims that have come to this country, they're coming from colonized lands, right?
Yes.
And so the parents and grandparents are just living out trauma-based patterns,
Yeah.
whereas, second generation, third generation has an opportunity because, we have safety, security, like unlike no other place in the world.
Yeah.
um I won't say anything else on that, but we do, right? So we do have that level of safety, security that they didn't have, that they were seeking and looking for.
Yeah.
So the lack of safety and security is more of an emotional one now. So
Yes.
we can get out of it, and we can go
Absolutely.
into living the way that we're meant to live, and even thriving rather than living in survival mode. And that means being aware of our emotional patterns,
Hmm.
thought patterns and behavior patterns. So
Yes.
maybe that could segue into coping mechanisms. And I just want to say salam to everybody who's on, all the people who have joined us. Welcome. We appreciate your comments and your contributions to this conversation. So yeah, maybe you can share a little bit about coping mechanisms, because we've gotten a little understanding about men and masculinity and how men feel and the background.
Hmm.
Coping mechanisms and how, yeah, Binat is saying awareness is key. So maybe you can talk about
Yeah.
coping mechanisms and awareness, connecting the dots around the behavior with
Yeah.
the pain of the coping mechanisms, and how it could be different for men and women.
Yeah. MashaAllah. Yeah, I think, yeah, whenever we're dealing with the issues that we have, we're gonna try to find avenues to mitigate that pain and to help us feel better. And it can be different. I think it's generally different for men and women, though there's obviously some overlap. I would say that, without getting too much into Islamic eschatology regarding the end times, but this is related. is that you have now, we have digital drugs that are now available. And I'll kind of speak more so to the Muslim community, right? Because I'll just say this, in the past, you know, if you watch a show like Mad Men, right? A lot of people know about Mad Men. It's like 1960s, you know, what are they always doing? They're always drinking. They're always out sleeping around.
Okay.
They're always smoking. They're doing all this other stuff. And these are like the traditional coping mechanisms of stress and worry and maybe feeling, you know, maybe feeling shame or dealing with the traumas of your own childhood, right? But for us as Muslims, you know, we have a religious code that sort of prevents us from going out of our homes and indulging in alcohol or indulging in drugs, even though some Muslims do that, right? But there's, for many of us, there's barriers to that. And, you know, for men, there is, I'll talk, the first part I'll talk about is coping mechanisms. I'll talk about a big coping mechanism is video games for men. And one of the reasons for that is that men are hardwired to want to achieve. There's a sort of desire to achieve, and a desire to be a warrior, and a desire to be a conqueror, and to be the master of your domain. And video games, they've actually made them so sophisticated now. They do market research on this, like how often do we give a squirt of dopamine to the player so that they keep playing, right? And it's often triggered about like accomplishments and like, okay, you beat this guy, okay, now you're on to the next person, and it's so on and so forth. So that's like speaking to the one sort of desire that men have, and the other one is on the big coping mechanism, and that even our children are now being exposed to, it is pornography. This, you can have, you know, men are biologically, we are inherently polygamous, right? There's a reason why polygamy and these sorts of things are part of the deen, is that men, they are biologically able to father many children, right? And there's this component where it's like, you know, that material, the illicit material, you know, makes you think, oh, you know, I'm so desirable, and I have all these women I can choose from now. And again, it also comes down to feeling powerful and feeling respected and wanted and these sorts of things too. And I think like these are the really big sort of addictive coping mechanisms that a lot of men are falling into. And it's interesting. I recently had a survey I released, and I got like about 36 respondents, so it wasn't a ton of people. And I still need to go through the data and really, and maybe it's not enough participants to draw conclusions. But one thing that was very interesting was that every single one of the men that responded said that they had struggled with addiction at one time or another.
Wow.
None of the women said that they struggled with addiction.
Really? Well.
And it was about half and half. Okay. So, and maybe the women weren't admitting it, I don't know. But the men, every single man said, I either struggle with addiction, and some said I have an addictive personality. And this was really very interesting, and something for us to be very aware of. And you know, it's these are really big issues in our time. SubhanAllah.
You know what I just thought of while I was listening to you? I have this book. I just pulled it out. It's called Teen Brain. I don't know if you've heard of this, right? And it really talks about, you can see how for the boy, the male, he's wired to the hits of dopamine that you get from the video game. And for the female, it's more of this wanting to be seen, heard, and men have this component too. But like the number of likes she gets, you know, who is acknowledging, you know, her posts, how she looks, and you know, is she fitting in, is she belonging, and all that stuff. And it talks a lot about what you mentioned in terms of how men are wired and how women are wired, and what that makes us more susceptible to, and what we reach out to cope with the internal pain or the internal hurt, or you know, like whatever the turbulence is, the inner turbulence that is going on, because it can feel scary, it can feel really uncomfortable, which hence the escape, right? We don't want to sit in that space. So maybe, you know, talk about that a little bit. Okay. The author is David Gillespie, and I thought it was a really great book. although at the end, there are solutions for no matter how old you are. And he kind of alludes to, like, you just got to wait until you get older. No, I mean, there are solutions to help people at all ages, and that includes, young people as well. So
There's another great comment here as well about addiction to love, approval, and food, which approval, with a social media post is what you just talked about, right? Approval. And it's, and one thought that just came to my head when I think about, if you look at just pure biological social constructs, like what's the biggest social biological capital of a man and the capital of a woman? And the man's capital, right, is his ability to achieve, to provide, to be a warrior. The woman's capital is her beauty, right? So it's often this capital of like sharing photos of being very dolled up and looking a certain way, and am I getting likes? Am I pretty enough? Do I look good enough? And it's so interesting how that need to be validated and that need to be valued. It's how it manifests differently for men and women, but we all have a need to be wanted and a need to be validated. And the first thing that we have to do is actually validate ourselves and value ourselves. And I think, I think a lot of us, men and women, maybe women won't believe this about men, but a lot of men also struggle with this, though it might come out in different ways.
Yes.
Right? We all need to feel valued.
It's a human need. It's a human need. But like you said, it manifests and it plays out in different ways for men and women, and how we attain that, how we meet those needs.
Yes, absolutely. And MashaAllah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wanting to attain. I just lost my train of thought.
No worries.
Too many hits to the head.
No worries. We're going to some like deep territory, and somebody asked, "What is the solution?" There is a solution, and it's part of the solution is understanding. Maybe people describe it different ways. For me, though, it's two things. It's one, understanding who you really are. And in order to know who you really are, you have to know your creator, because you as a soul, right? Not what you've been conditioned to believe or the messages that you've received about, who you are, your personality. So that's a journey in itself, and understanding that. And the other thing is understanding your human experience, and not being afraid of your feelings, and not being afraid of what you're experiencing, because when we can hold space for ourselves and sit in that, then there's so much to learn and there's so much to grow when we sit in that space. It's when we can't sit in the space and we want to escape. Yeah. Right? And that's what we were talking about in the coping mechanisms.
Yes.
Go ahead. Were you going to say something?
It's interesting. Like, I was reflecting on a lot of the questions that you shared with me, that a lot of your audience shared with you about men, and I really saw this pattern of sort of narcissistic behavior that a lot of these women were experiencing from men. And it's funny, when you research narcissism and actually understand what causes narcissism, a lot of times it is actually being abused and being denied and being shamed, and just having that pile on over and over again, to the point where there's some people actually say there's a false self that gets developed that is so, you create this illusory self that is so perfect and so wonderful to protect the real self, and then over time the real self actually dies, and then now you have this narcissistic self that constantly needs validation. It constantly needs narcissistic fuel. And so we have to understand that even people who, like, we might think are evil, and it's like, my ex-husband was so terrible, and he was so thoughtless and so selfish, and it's like, well, we have to acknowledge those things, that yes, if I was abused and I was hurt by a spouse, I have to acknowledge that. But maybe we get to a point eventually to understand, well, you know what, hurt people, right? There's that maxim outside of sociopaths and psychopaths, people who are like born without empathy. Most people are not born that way. They have capacities for empathy and for care. And
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create them that way. It's the nurture versus nature.
Yeah.
right? The fitra, the
Yeah.
nature is of wholeness, goodness, well-being, and hardwired to connect to Allah and the self and people around them. It's how we get nurtured in our
Yeah.
environments, right? So,
Mhm.
and thus,
Inshallah.
we understand what kind of home you came from, what kind of household, what kind of
Yeah.
experiences you had. All of that can shape who you become, but you always have a choice in who you choose to be.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's kind of the kicker here is that you still have free will, you still have agency, and we still have the responsibility to work on ourselves. And it can be so challenging because often we create, especially I would say for men, right? Like, we've been modeled certain things, we've been taught certain things about what manliness is, what it means to be a man. And sometimes if we feel like we don't live up to that, we create these false narratives about ourselves where it's like, okay, I am this way. But actually we're committing a form of kufr because it's like, no, I know inherently that there's something, I have shortcomings.
Mm.
But it goes so much against this narrative I've created about myself. I cannot bear to acknowledge this fear or this anxiety or this shame that I have inside of me. So it's just too painful to even acknowledge. So I'll just continue down my path of trying to receive validation from outside of myself, whether it be through, constantly, divorce one wife, marry another one, whether it's getting into fights or being promiscuous or whatever the case may be that we cope with things to do. And it kind of comes back to your point about we have to know ourselves, that the knowledge of ourselves and the knowledge of our Lord are so deeply intertwined
Mm-hmm.
that, Allah says in the Quran, I will show them my signs in themselves and on the horizons. There the signs in yourself. A lot of the mufassirun, the scholars of tafsir, they say the signs within you are actually much greater than the signs outside of you. So the signs that are within us are much more profound, but it takes a lot of work to get there. And I really, I think it's having this sort of system in place where we understand the principles of Islam. We understand our internal cosmology that Allah created us with, that you have a ruh, you have a spirit that, and Allah, He made you for a reason, and He made you the way that you are for a reason.
Yeah.
And you have gifts and talents and things about you, men or women, that the world needs from you. And it's so important to accept who you are and be merciful with yourself, because a lot of times the people who are the harshest and who are the most abusive, they're actually very harsh to themselves,
Yeah.
and they actually hate themselves
Right.
very
It's
profoundly.
very
And
profound. So they just project that outward, the same
yeah,
level of self-hate or self-criticism that they receive, which is how they treat themselves, and that
yes,
therefore is what they project outward in all their relationships. Um,
yes,
which, yeah, see, we can only understand this if we pause to get out of victimhood and blaming, the blame game, and pause to understand, to look to understand what is really going on here. And what's my role? How do I show up in situations like this? And Asumini is saying we have to look at how we parent our sons as well to shift these instances
yes,
of narcissism we are seeing. Absolutely, because you're talking about the mother-in-law who is very controlling and judgmental and critical and harsh, which she probably experienced. Now she's going
hmm,
to project that onto, and that's a persona of a person who's very insecure. So then they need to
yeah,
control people, and then that spills onto the son. And then you have this man going out who is supposed to be a leader and a protector and a provider for his new family that he's creating. But there's this, we like to call it emotional manipulation or emotional blackmail.
yeah.
um, you know
Mashallah.
that comes from these attachments that
Yes,
are built on top of guilt and obligation and shame. um,
yeah,
and so then there's what does the man do? Like, he's just living out his programming.
yeah. That's what he saw growing up. Like that was normal. for him,
Yeah.
that like, and also I would say too, and it seems like, from what I've seen, what I've heard, it's like the way that we raise our boys too in the Muslim community, you know, it seems like there's like no accountability, and there's like, the boy can kind of do whatever he wants, and he gets spoiled by everybody, and this
Particularly
is a
the
big,
women. The women have
particularly the women,
you
a
know
big
this
problem.
term enabling, right? This
Yeah,
term
oh
enabling.
yeah, and this happens not just in the Muslim community, by the way. This is something that, this happens with white people too. I'm a white convert, and my relatives and my family's been here for generations, and this happens. Enabling happens everywhere, and
Yeah.
uh, and this is why it's so important that you have masculine, secure, manly men. And I actually wrote a post recently called "Manliness and Masculinity," right? Because there's a difference.
Yes.
Manliness comes from masculine. It's built upon masculinity, but we need to have two components. You first of all have to have a very strongly developed masculinity in the first place, which a lot of men, we're finding out now, even empirical data shows this. Men are have lower testosterone levels. Their grip strength, right? There's a study on how strong is your grip, like how much pounds per square inch can a person's grip, hold. Our fathers and our grandfathers are much stronger than we are in general, right? So there's this lower testosterone, and is a lack of masculinity, but there's also this other component of how do you actually develop and channel that masculinity in a way that is prophetic, that follows, the sunnah of the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that follows the intellectual, spiritual, and actionable precepts of Islam, right? So we have to have both the morals and the intellectual component and the spiritual component, but there's also this very important biological component as well that has to be developed. And I see that I think sometimes, with certain movements and things like this, there are grievances that are very real
Hmm.
that women have, which we have to acknowledge that. But so very often we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and this is where like terms like saying toxic masculinity, when you say it enough, it actually just starts to mean masculinity is toxic
Right, which is what we're
instead of
seeing now. So that's
Mhm.
another way that the male is being threatened.
Yeah, and you see that there's this whole movement called the red pill movement, that's just sort of this response towards um, towards modernity and towards feminism and third wave feminism and these sorts of things. And a lot of men, when you read what they say, some of the questions I received from some of your audience, was saying things like, why are men so dishonest? And why are men, why are they lack loyalty? Why are they this way and that way? And I thought to myself, I've seen the same exact questions from men directed towards women, actually. And so a lot of it is character driven, and being honest with ourselves, and I'll say this kind of, we have to, this is where accountability is so important. And besides cases where there's clear abuse and there's, clear things like this, besides cases like that, accountability is so important because um, this is the only way that we're actually going to get anywhere.
Mm.
And mashallah, it's so challenging though, but it's so very much needed and very important.
Yeah, I mean, I just like how you unpacked, a little bit of narcissism. No, you actually unpacked what's happening in narcissism and how the cycle is repeating itself. And you unpacked a lot of like being able to look at a man who is maybe hurting you or destroying you with his actions and his behaviors as a hurt little boy.
Yeah,
Because in his mind, emotionally, he's just replaying out the hurts and the pains at
yeah,
when he was a boy, right? Or
absolutely.
and and how the self-loathing and the self-hatred is just too much to bear, that
Yeah,
it's easier to escape that, and it's easier to get your needs met, because we all have needs, right? And all of it, Maslow's
Hmm.
hierarchy of needs, and
Yeah.
to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, to be accepted, right? All of those things. And if you can't do that for yourself, if you can't accept yourself,
Yeah.
if you can't see yourself, if you can't understand yourself, it's too painful, then you're going to try to get those needs met through, like you said, actions and behavior, whether it's, cheating, or whether it's being dishonest or disloyal, whatever
Yeah.
those things are that cause, betrayal and hurt and pain in with people in relationships. It just takes it to another level. Like, okay, we're talking about wounded men, and looking at the person in front of you as a wounded man with compassion. Somebody asked this question. What do they ask? They ask, sorry, any tips on dealing with addressing narcissistic family members? And I think to that point, like, if you recognize, and many times for women, they don't understand what's happening if they're even dealing with a narcissist. And I don't necessarily like to put labels on people. However,
Yeah.
when something doesn't feel right, you're feeling like, all these terms we hear, you're being gaslighted, right? Or your
Hmm.
reality
Yeah.
is being denied, right?
Yes.
And so you're in this mental haze or fog, and you could either blame the other person, you'll get nowhere, or you can blame yourself and you deal with more shame and guilt, and that's not going to be helpful
Yeah.
either. So it's
Yep.
not about blame, but it's about understanding yourself, understanding the other person. So maybe you can just help us with, if a
Yeah.
woman is in a relationship and she recognizes that she's in a relationship with a narcissistic man, maybe you can give some tips
Mashallah.
around how
Mm.
to
Yeah.
approach that.
This is so challenging, and I really feel for people. I want to say a few things that are related to this. A really great friend of mine, a teacher of mine, he said something so profound to me about men and women, about things like this. He said, "Nobody can hurt a righteous woman like a wicked man, and nobody can hurt a righteous man like a wicked woman."
Mm.
And it's just amazing how it just goes to sort of speak to our connectedness and how connected we are. But and then one more point before I answer your question that's also related to this is I wanted to say this is that when it comes to accountability and to building ourselves up, when we build ourselves up and we start to have more confidence and we start to value ourselves and we start to deepen our relationship with Allah, you'll start to actually attract people who are like that. And the narcissist will have nothing to do with you. And the person that wants to gaslight you and take advantage of you, they don't want people who are confident and powerful in their life. They like people they can victimize and abuse. And so if you have a spouse who is clearly displaying signs of narcissism, this is a trial that is very challenging and very, very hard to deal with. But I would say that I'm not the kind of person to recommend divorces and stuff like this, because these are people to figure this out on their own. But I would say really a big component about if you're dealing with one or have had dealt with one in the past, you have to really learn how to love yourself and value yourself and respect yourself, so that the narcissist no longer has that same level of control and influence on you, because they're only able to control and influence people who have a lot of low self-esteem, who doubt themselves, who doubt their instincts. And when we become confident and we start tapping into that light that is within inside of us, that Allah placed within inside of us, you have an immense power then. And I have a sister that I know. I've known her for a number of years, and she's an amazing, amazing mother. She's a great human being, has a South Asian background, and she married somebody who was a narcissist and was a former convict, and he's the way he is for a lot of reasons, of course, but he made his choices. And she I think got to a point where she prayed to Allah. She said, "Allah, either change him or remove him from my life," because it was becoming to be too much for her. And just like that, it was like it just, the process was made so easy, and he left, and they got, and now she's doing much better. And so sometimes things like that do need to happen. And divorce is not a swear word. It's not a dirty word. And I think you made a post recently that in our culture, in Islamic culture, Islam, in the religion of Islam, divorce is not a sin. It's not something to be ashamed of. This is something that many of the Sahaba were divorced. And it can be challenging, no doubt, to go through a divorce. However, we do not have that same level of guilt about it that the Christians do. We've sort of adopted that because we were colonized by Christians, I think. But divorce is sometimes an option when you're dealing with somebody who just isn't capable of treating you in the way that you should be treated. And this goes for both men and women. I also know men, a dear brother of mine, who his wife was, he's an honest, beautiful human being. And he's like, this was years ago though. It's like his wife just didn't do anything he was doing everything. I mean, he was working, he was taking care of the kids, he was cooking for the kids, and it's like she just couldn't do anything for the family, really. And it wasn't just that stuff, like domestic chores. There was other things there too, and the divorce was the right thing for him in that case. And sometimes it is the right thing.
Yeah.
So that's something we have to remember. And it's not always the answer, but it sometimes is.
Right, right. I love how you mentioned, like, when you get to knowing yourself in a way where you value and you respect and you honor yourself the way that Allah has honored you.
And that's our fitrah, by the way.
That's
right?
It, right? That thing is that we have been conditioned to not see that, to not know that, to not believe that. And instead we're believing all these other things that cause the self-loathing.
Yes.
And yeah, and from my own experience and the work that I do is the woman can either, like, I help women, so working with the woman, she can get herself to that space, but that's going to take effort and investment and work to unlearn the patterns of thinking and beliefs that have led her to have a low self-esteem, because we're not born that way. How kids are so confident, they're so resilient, and they're just like, nothing, like, they get hurt, they get up and go, right? Yeah. And so they're to unlearn the patterns that have caused your low self-esteem, your lack of self-confidence, and your lack of value and worth. That's like reprogramming your brain. And the beautiful thing is that human beings were able to do that. Like, there was a time that there was a belief that this wasn't possible, but in terms of the science, the neuroplasticity, that we can rewire and reprogram our brains, right? Getting back to our fitra. So, and then at that point, I like to tell women is that, focus on yourself first. Make sure you're safe. Yes, all those things. Build yourself up, as you said, right? And then you can make the right decision with clarity and confidence and calm and tawakkul, which is right for you, right? Because either you're going to shift, which happens, then the husband shifts or the partner shifts, right? Because you're showing up in a different way. You're no longer showing up in the way. When you have self-value and respect and self-honor, you know, in the language today, we call this as boundaries, but I call this self-respect, and self-love, that's rooted in love of Allah. So we don't allow people to harm us and hurt us, because hurting another person and hurting yourself, to Allah, it's the same thing.
Yeah. So that's absolutely, it's such a great thing to remember, that too, is that you have rights just like other people have rights. That's the thing to remember, because some of us get into these patterns where, there's oftentimes it's called the narcissist empath dichotomy, combo. Right? And the empath is like, just, they don't consider their rights at all. They're constantly considering the needs and rights of others, but it's actually, they're doing it hoping that other people would do it for them. Yeah,
they're
it's an interesting thing.
It's a form of people pleasing. Like, instead of Allah pleasing, they're seeking that in something other than Allah. So that
Yeah.
ends up becoming our greatest tests, actually, when we seek things that are not meant to be sought in anything other than Allah.
And this is so important, you know, the relationship with Allah, and I would say Allah and His Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is so important, because this is, you know, when you rely on Allah, He will make things easier for you. You can try to heal yourself by yourself, but you're not going to get very far very fast. But if you're like begging Allah all the time to help you, and I'll say this, you know, a lot of the scholars, they talk about the benefits of Salawat and Nabi. Salawat and Nabi is a tremendous way of feeling Allah's mercy and having this sort of gentle cleansing of the heart. And one of my teachers, he says, you know, it's like, ask him, what kind of dhikr should I do? Read the Quran and do salawat. And really, you know, if you develop a daily practice of Quran recitation and salawat on the Prophet ﷺ, and of maybe other adhkar, these things will also be great benefits.
I'm thinking of it as like an addiction, right? Like if you get addicted to having that dhikr and that salawat, like you feel restless if you're not doing it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
That's a good thing to be addicted to.
It's a good addiction, absolutely. And it's funny, you know, that the brother I mentioned earlier, Kareem Sirajuddin, he says the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yes.
And so it's really, you're connected, and you need that. You constantly need that connection, and these things are transformative, and it will help you become more introspective. You know, as you reflect on the Quran and you recite it, and you are doing salawat, imagining, you know, the mercy of the Prophet ﷺ, these things will start to help you become more introspective, and you're able to start to become more honest with yourself and look at yourself, and then you start to value yourself. You're like, well, wait a minute, like, Allah made me, and not only did He make me, He made me a believer, and He made me a believer who prays. So what does that say about me? What does Allah think of me if He's given me the tawfiq to do these good things? So
yeah,
you know, we have to change our minds about this. I think sometimes we have this idea that we have to beat down our nafs and beat ourselves down, and it's like, no, we're beaten down enough as it is for the most part. Some people need their egos to be a little more bludgeoned, but I think that's not as prominent as we might think. I think a lot of people in this time really need a lot of patience and gentleness and love, and ourselves as individuals are no exception to that. You need to be patient with yourself and loving to yourself, and if you make a mistake, make istighfar and make tawbah and keep moving. Because there's no point.
I love that. Yeah, look, putting yourself in the equation when you're being kind or compassionate and forgiving and overlooking, you know. So I love that advice, and you know, we've been talking for like an hour now, and this topic is like, I mean, there's no limit to how deep we can go and where we can go with this. And I'd love to hear your takeaways and your comments while we, you know, focus on wrapping up. For those of you who have been with us or have heard part of it, what are you taking away from our conversation today? And Brother Jordan, I would just ask you to, in terms of kind of tying this together and closing it out, how do you see us being able to help and support each other on this journey of, you know, individual healing, but yet at the same time also collective healing, and getting back to the honor and dignity that the Prophet, peace be upon him, brought to our deen, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed us with in our ummah?
Well, I think the first part is that when you heal yourself, you then have the ability to help heal others. And when you become a healed, integrated, well-balanced individual, you become a mercy for others, actually. That people are sort of in your shade, that they feel safe with you. They feel this person is authentic. This person actually is sincere, and they don't have ulterior motives. And I think starting with ourselves and um, getting our cognitive frames correct and our paradigms correct is so important, because there's a lot of talk about healing that we can benefit from, but that does not follow the paradigms of our faith. So we really need to be soundly rooted in truth, which is brought to us by Allah through His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is so important that we get our knowledge right, and then we really focus on healing ourselves, and that we really try our best to be a source of mercy for others. And maybe we can't save the world, and we have limits to what we can do, but making that intention of getting ourselves right, and then maybe being able to help others, is, I think, really powerful. And make it about Allah first and foremost. The reason why we're healing is we want Allah to be happy with us. We want to get closer to Him. We want to be in Jannah with the Prophet ﷺ. We want to be in Jannah constantly witnessing the face of Allah, as He tells us in sound hadith, that the believer will witness Allah in the garden. And this is so important. And inshallah, if we get our principles right, and we make it about Allah, and we just take it one step at a time, inshallah, we'll get there. And understand that women, sometimes we attract into our lives things that correspond to the energy that we give off. And
the Prophet, peace be upon him, said the believer is a mirror to each other, right?
Absolutely. And as you become a more high quality individual in terms of your heart and in terms of your emotional balance, and you'll start to see that there'll be people who will leave your life.
Yeah.
And there'll be new people who come in that are much better. So these are some things I think that are really important to take away. And we need each other ultimately. Men and women, we need each other. We can't do this alone. And the world needs both masculine and feminine energy. It has to have both. It can't just be one or the other. So inshallah, hopefully that's suffices for now.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. We have a takeaway here. It says, reminder of self-love and respecting oneself, and daily adhkars, salawat. Beautiful reminder from Ashu 19. Thank you for sharing that. I just want to thank you for your time, your presence, your knowledge, and your experience, and being able to articulate it and share it with everyone here on this platform, so we can benefit from that, and we can take something away when we go back into our daily lives and interacting with our partners, with our siblings, with family members, in relationships, and how to do that from a little bit more of a heightened awareness. That will benefit us. And I look forward to having more conversations in how we can continue supporting each other and continue being allies in this game of life that we're in the dunya. So jazakallah khair so much. And
thank you.
Tell us where people can get in touch with you or find you, or get support from you.
So best place to reach me is just direct message me on renewing.rujula on Instagram. So if you look up renewing rujula on Instagram, I should be the only one. And I think that's the best way just to reach out with questions that you have. And I'm inshallah working to get to a point where I start to offer programming and things that are more direct and more intimate with people, more individuated. But inshallah, we're getting there one step at a time. So a lot of right now is just going to be continuing with the sort of the essays and the short
that's
videos here and
wonderful.
there.
That's wonderful.
So,
There's so much to learn from that. Yeah, and for those who are not aware or don't know, can you explain a little bit what is this your handle mean, renewing Rujula?
mashallah. So, Rujula, it's manliness, roughly translates as manliness, but it's funny that I think the word muru'a in Arabic is probably a better word, but because Rujula more so focuses on masculinity, if you look it up in the Hans Wehr. But I will say this, that if you know, oftentimes the ulama of tasawwuf, they talk about the rijal of Allah, the men of Allah. And so that's where I got Rujula from, was focusing on that sort of man. And actually a lot of the great masters of that tradition, they say that women can also be rijal of Allah. It's not just only biological males who are these great men of Allah, right? Women are also included in that. So Rujula is both speaking to the renewing of masculinity and bringing it to life, but also of that higher level of manliness, of a manliness that is rooted in the principles of Islam and takes from the examples of our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam and from his blessed Sahaba radiallahu anhum.
Wonderful. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing all that in your presence. I look forward to doing this again, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Right.
Allah bless you. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing. This kind of work for men and women is needed. May Allah give us tawfiq and help us, and may He use us in the best way possible. Ameen.
Ameen, ameen. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Walaikum assalam wa
Thank
rahmatullah.
everyone for joining us and being here with us and your participation
Thank you all.
comments.
Assalam.